His eyes pierced me like a cold blade as he raised his hand, and the entire hall fell silent. I trembled, expecting another humiliation, another cruel name thrown at me, but his voice cut through the air. "She is my moon." The world seemed to stop. Laughter died in others' throats, and I, who had always been nothing, felt the weight of becoming everything. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. I remember the cold before anything else. A cold that didn't come from the wind, but from within, as if the entire world had decided I didn't belong anywhere. It was always like that on full moon nights. The windows would open, the lights would turn on in the grand houses, and I would remain outside, observing the rituals of those born with a marked destiny. They, the children of the moon, the heirs of power, looked at me with the same curiosity one reserves for a mistake. They said my blood was weak, that the moon had forgotten me, that even the gods looked away when they saw me pass. I was the daughter of a maid who died too soon, and of a father who never spoke my name. I grew up among the leftovers of others' parties, collecting broken glasses, hearing laughter muffled by doors. I learned to be silent before I learned to speak. My skin carried the exact tone of scandal, my presence a reminder of everything they despised. The crossing of power and error, sin and blood. My mother would hold my hands when I was little and whisper that the moon would one day see me, that I wasn't invisible, but she left before she could teach me to believe it, and I was left alone with the certainty that to be seen was just another way of being destroyed. The years passed slowly, each marked by disdainful glances and words that cut deeper than any blade. I learned to walk close to the walls, to lower my eyes when they passed, to make my body take up as little space as possible. But no matter how much I tried to disappear, there was always someone to remind me that I existed, and that my existence was an offense. The noble's daughters laughed when I stumbled carrying baskets that were too heavy. The warriors' sons pushed me in the hallways just to see if I would dare to fight back. I never fought back. I learned that survival demanded silence. My maternal grandmother, the only family I had left, worked in the kitchens of the central castle. She was a woman bent by time and labor, with rough hands and a tired gaze. She taught me that there was dignity even in servitude, that honest work was worth more than the empty pride of those born into golden cradles. But I saw how she trembled when the nobles passed, how she bowed her head even lower than I did, and I wondered if that was truly dignity or just fear disguised as resignation. She said I should be grateful for a roof and food, that many had less. And it was true, but something inside me, something small and stubborn, refused to be grateful for scraps. When I turned 16, the presentation ritual came for me as it does for all the young women of our community. It was the moment when each girl was brought before the available alphas so they could choose or reject a mate. For the daughters of nobles, it was a celebration, a party where expensive dresses and brilliant jewels guaranteed attention and proposals. For me, it was a sentence. My grandmother sewed a simple dress from the scraps she could gather, and I wore it knowing it wouldn't matter. There wasn't enough sparkle in the world to hide what I was. A bastard. Rejected before I was even seen. The first alpha who rejected me did so with irony, smiling like one who forgives a foolish child. He was young with golden hair and light eyes, the son of one of the oldest families. When they called me before him, I felt all eyes turned to me, and the weight of those gazes almost made me faint. He observed me from head to toe, his eyes lingering on my patched dress, the absence of jewelry, the hair I had braided with my own hands. Then he smiled, that smile that seemed kind but hid venom, and said loud enough for all to hear, "I appreciate the honor, but I'm looking for someone whose blood will not shame my future children." There was laughter. Laughter that echoed through the walls of the great hall and embedded itself in my chest like shards of ice. The second rejected me in silence, simply stepping away as I approached, as if the air around me wounded him. He didn't even look at my face. He just turned his back and walked toward one of a lord's daughters, a girl with fair skin and a perfect smile. I stood there, motionless in the center of the hall, feeling the floor open up beneath my feet. I wanted to run, to disappear, to cease to exist, but my legs wouldn't move, and all I could do was breathe, just breathe as the world kept spinning around me as if nothing had happened. The third was the worst. He was older, a respected warrior with scars on his face and a ruthless reputation. When my turn came, he neither smiled nor looked away. He stared directly at me with a coldness that froze me from the inside out, and then he raised his voice. "Not even the moon wants this one," he said, pointing at me as if I were something dirty. Why should I? The assembly erupted in laughter again, but this time it was different. This time I felt something break inside me, something I didn't know was still whole. It was as if all the previous humiliations had accumulated in that instant, and their weight finally crushed me completely. I fled the hall before they could see my tears. I ran through the cold corridors of the castle, down the stone stairs that led to the cellars, until I found a dark corner where no one would find me. And there alone I let it all out. I cried until I had no more tears, until my throat ached and my body trembled with exhaustion. And when I finally stopped, when the silence returned, I made a promise to myself. I would never bow before them again. I would never again ask for approval, never again wait to be chosen. If the world didn't want me, then I would learn not to want the world back. But life in the castle gave me no choice. I had to work, to eat, to survive. So I swallowed what little pride I had and returned to my duties, serving the same people who had laughed at me, cleaning the halls where I had been humiliated, pretending nothing had changed. But something had changed. I had changed. I began to notice things that had previously escaped me. The lies hidden behind polite smiles, the betrayals whispered in dark corners, the fear that even the most powerful carried. And I began to understand that maybe, just maybe, being invisible wasn't a weakness. Maybe it was a weapon. The months dragged on, and gradually my life returned to what it had always been. Work, silence, loneliness. My grandmother fell ill in the winter, and I spent weeks caring for her between one task and another. She was sometimes delirious, calling my mother's name, asking for forgiveness for things I didn't understand. On one of those nights, she gripped my hand with surprising strength and said, "You are stronger than you think. The moon will still see you." I no longer believed in promises about the moon, but I squeezed her hand back and pretended I did. She died 3 days later, and I was completely alone in the world. The funeral was simple, just me and a few other servants who had worked with her over the years. No noble attended, no kind words were spoken. We buried my grandmother on a grey morning, under a fine rain that seemed to weep for her when I no longer could. And when I returned to the castle, I entered the small room we had shared and realized that everything left of my family fit into a single wooden box. Some old clothes, a broken comb, and a silver locket my mother used to wear. I opened the locket and found 2 intertwined strands of hair inside, one dark and one light. I didn't know whose they were, but I kept the locket as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The seasons changed, and with them came rumors that the kingdom was about to have a new leader. The old king had died without direct heirs, and the succession would be decided by combat and council. Several alphas claimed the throne, each with their alliances and armies. There was tension in the air for weeks, like a storm about to break. The nobles whispered in the corridors, the warriors sharpened their weapons, and we, the servants, just tried to go unnoticed as power changed hands. And then he arrived. The man who would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. He came from the north, from distant lands where winter never ended and wolves were larger than horses. They said he was born under an eclipse, marked by the black moon, and that his name struck fear into even the bravest hearts. They said he knew no mercy, that he killed without hesitation, that his gaze alone could break any man's will. And when he entered the castle for the first time, surrounded by his silent warriors, I understood that the rumors were no exaggeration. He was tall, taller than any man I had ever seen, with broad shoulders and a presence that seemed to fill all the space around him. His hair was as black as night, long enough to brush his shoulders, and his eyes were a grey so dark they seemed almost black. He didn't smile, didn't gesture, didn't hurry. He just walked, and the world bowed around him. I was in the hall that day, collecting glasses after a banquet, and when he passed me, I felt a wave of something I couldn't name. It wasn't exactly fear, though there was fear there too. It was something more primitive, something that put every cell in my body on alert. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. It was so quick I thought I had imagined it, but in that brief instant, I felt as if he had seen right through me, as if he could read every thought, every secret, every hidden scar. Then he moved on, and I stood there, holding a glass, my heart beating so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. I shook my head, telling myself I was being foolish, that men like him didn't see people like me. But for days, I couldn't get that look out of my mind. The following weeks were a succession of meetings and negotiations as the Alphas vied for the throne. There were duels, broken alliances, discovered betrayals, and through it all, he remained unshaken like a mountain in the midst of a storm. One by one, his rivals fell or bowed until only he remained. The coronation was set for the night of the next full moon, a grand ceremony that would bring together all the important families of the kingdom. And all the inhabitants of the castle, including the servants, were required to attend. I didn't want to go. The last time I had been in a hall full of nobles, it was to be publicly humiliated. But there was no choice. I wore the same patched dress I had worn on that terrible night, because it was the only one I had, and I braided my hair as best I could. When I looked at myself in the small broken mirror in my room, I saw the face of a tired woman, older than her years, with eyes that had seen too much and expected too little. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and forced myself to go down to the great hall. The place was transformed. Enormous chandeliers illuminated every corner, and the walls were covered with tapestries that told the history of the kingdom. The marble floor shone so brightly you could see reflections, and the air was heavy with the scent of incense and spices. The nobles were all present, dressed in their finest clothes, jewels sparkling in the candlelight. The women looked like poisonous flowers, beautiful and deadly, with their vibrantly coloured dresses and sharp smiles. The men were restrained predators, watching each other with poorly disguised suspicion. I was instructed to stay near the doors, along with the other servants, ready to serve if necessary. I pressed my back against the cold wall and tried to make myself invisible, as I always did. But I felt the stares, those stares I knew so well. The ladies watched me with disdain, their mouths covered by fans as they whispered among themselves. I knew what they were saying. The bastard, the rejected one, the one who dared to be there dressed in unblessed white. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to remember why I continued to endure it all. But the truth was, I had nowhere to go. This was my hell, but it was the only place I knew. The music began to play, a solemn melody announcing the arrival of the future king. The back doors opened and he entered. The silence that accompanied him was thick, almost palpable, as if even the air was afraid to make a sound in his presence. Everyone bowed, nobles and servants alike, but I kept my eyes open, watching. He crossed the hall with measured steps, every movement calculated, every gesture laden with power. He wore a black cloak that seemed to absorb the light around it, and on his shoulders was the pelt of a white wolf, huge and magnificent. But it was his face that held the attention, handsome in a cruel way with hard lines and an impassive expression. It was the face of someone who had seen the worst of the world and decided not to bow to it. He ascended to the dais where the throne waited, an imposing structure of black stone and silver. The priest approached, carrying the lunar crown, an ancient piece made of a metal that seemed to glow with its own light. Words were spoken, promises made, but I barely heard. I was lost in thought, remembering all the times I'd been invisible, all the times I had wished to be someone else, somewhere else. I didn't notice when the ceremony ended, when he officially became king. I only realized when the hall erupted in applause and cheers, and he raised a hand, calling for silence. The crowd obeyed instantly. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and clear, each word echoing off the walls like a decree from the gods. He spoke of honor, of strength, of the need to unite the kingdom under a single banner. He spoke of the challenges to come, of the enemies lurking beyond the borders. And then he did something no one expected. His eyes swept across the hall, examining every face, every person present. And suddenly, inexplicably, his gaze met mine. My heart stopped. I tried to look away, as I always did, but I couldn't. It was as if an invisible force held me captive to that grey, relentless gaze. He watched me for long seconds, and the entire hall noticed. I felt the attention turn to me, felt the weight of hundreds of curious and hostile stares. The murmuring began low like the buzzing of bees, but it grew until it was impossible to ignore. Who was I? Why was the new king looking at me? What had I done to deserve his attention? And then he descended from the dais. Each step he took toward me made my body tremble more. The nobles moved aside as he passed, creating a direct path between us. I wanted to run, to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare. But my legs wouldn't obey, and all I could do was stand there frozen as the most powerful man in the kingdom walked toward me. When he finally stopped before me, so close I could feel the warmth of his body, I realized I was visibly shaking. He said nothing for a moment. He just studied me, as if trying to solve a puzzle. His eyes traced my face, my hair, my patched dress, then returned to my face. And then, without warning, he raised a hand and lightly touched my chin, forcing me to lift my face to meet his gaze. The touch was gentle but firm, and it sent a wave of heat through my entire body. I heard the whispers around us grow louder, more frantic, but they seemed to come from far away. That was when a woman's voice cut through the air. It was sweet and venomous at the same time, calculated to sound innocent while driving a dagger. "Your Majesty," she said, and I recognized the voice. It was Lady Morgana, one of the most beautiful and cruel women at court, daughter of one of the most powerful lords. "Surely your Majesty is not aware of this creature's reputation. She is the rejected one, the one not even the moon wanted." Nervous laughter echoed through the hall, laughter that cut me as it had before. I closed my eyes, waiting for him to push me away, to humiliate me like all the others. But he didn't push me away. His hand was still under my chin, keeping my face raised. And when he spoke, his voice came out low, but so clear that every person in the hall could hear it. "She is my moon." 3 words. Just 3 words, but the world stopped. The laughter died instantly. The silence that followed was so absolute, I could hear the crackling of the candles, the whisper of the wind against the heavy curtains. I opened my eyes and found his still fixed on mine, and there was something there I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't love, it wasn't desire. It was something deeper, more ancient. It was recognition. He finally released me and turned to face the hall. No one dared to speak, no one dared to move. He looked at each of the 3 alphas who had rejected me, one by one, and they lowered their eyes, unable to hold his gaze. He looked at Lady Morgana, who had grown pale and seemed to want to disappear into her own dress. And then, without another word, he returned to the throne, leaving me there in the center of the hall, with all eyes on me and my heart beating so hard it felt like it would escape my chest. I don't remember how I managed to get out of there. I only remember suddenly being in the cold corridors, away from the stairs and whispers, leaning against a stone wall trying to breathe. My mind was spinning out of control, trying to process what had just happened. Why had he done that? What did I mean to him? And more importantly, what did it mean for me? I wasn't foolish enough to believe in fairy tales. Powerful men didn't choose women like me for love. There was always a reason, always a game behind every gesture. But what was his game? In the days that followed, I quickly realized my life had changed in ways I wasn't prepared to face. The other servants avoided me, afraid of being associated with me. The nobles watched me with ill-disguised hatred, as if I had stolen something that belonged to them. The women of the court, especially, treated me with renewed cruelty, finding small ways to humiliate me whenever possible. Once, Lady Morgana deliberately bumped into me, causing me to spill wine on an expensive tapestry, and then shouted loud enough for everyone to hear about my incompetence. Another time, I found my dress torn to shreds when I returned to my room. But there was a difference now. Before, I would have accepted everything in silence, bowed my head and carried on. Now, something inside me had changed. Maybe it was his words echoing in my mind. "She is my moon." Or maybe it was simply that I was tired of being trampled on. I began to fight back, not with violence, but with direct gazes, with polite but firm refusals, with a new posture that said I would no longer bow. And I noticed something interesting. They didn't know how to deal with it. They were used to my submission, and my resistance confused them. The king, for his part, kept his distance. He didn't speak to me again, didn't seek me out, gave no further public sign that I existed. But I felt his eyes. At meetings, at dinners, on any occasion where our paths crossed, I felt the weight of his gaze on me. It was unnerving and, at the same time, strangely comforting. It was like having an invisible shield, a silent protection. No one would dare to cause me real harm while he watched me, even if he didn't intervene. A week after the coronation, I was summoned to the Royal Council. My heart sank when I received the message. The council was composed of the most powerful lords, the most influential alphas, the cruelest minds in the kingdom. There was no reason for a servant to be there, unless it was to be judged, tested, humiliated. I put on my simplest dress, refused to wear any adornment that might seem pretentious, and walked to the council room with trembling legs, but my head held high. When I entered, all eyes turned to me. The king was seated at the head of the long, dark wood table, and around him were men I recognized from seeing them in the corridors. Lord Aldrich, a middle-aged man with a greying beard and snake-like eyes. Lord Brennan, young and ambitious, always smiling, but with a smile that never reached his eyes. And several others, each more intimidating than the last. I stood near the door, waiting for instructions, but no one said anything for long moments. It was Lord Aldrich who finally broke the silence. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "surely there is an explanation for the presence of this young woman here. She has no title, no noble blood, nothing to justify her presence in matters of state." Murmurs of agreement echoed through the room. I clasped my hands behind my back to hide their trembling, but kept my expression neutral. The king did not answer immediately. He just picked up a goblet of wine, drank slowly, and set it back on the table with a soft sound that somehow echoed loudly in the silent room. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost bored. I summoned her. "Is that not explanation enough?" There was a tense pause. Lord Aldrich forced a smile. "Certainly, Your Majesty. But with all due respect, the council has the right to question decisions that affect the kingdom. And this woman's presence, especially considering what happened at the coronation, has caused disquiet." "Disquiet," the king repeated, as if savouring the word. "Interesting." He stood up and everyone tensed. It was impressive how his mere presence changed the atmosphere of a room. He walked slowly around the table, his hands clasped behind his back, and stopped behind Lord Aldrich's chair. "You are disquieted because I chose to acknowledge a woman you despise. Because she doesn't fit into your little boxes of class and blood. Because my choice challenges your notions of how the world should work." The silence was now oppressive. Lord Aldrich tried to turn, but the king placed a hand on the back of his chair, keeping him in place. "Let me be clear," the king continued, and his voice had lost any trace of boredom. Now it was pure steel. "I owe no explanation to any of you for my personal choices. But since you insist on questioning, I will offer a response. This woman has survived where others would have broken. She was publicly humiliated, rejected by men not worth the dirt under her feet, and yet she remained standing. She did not ask for my protection, did not beg for recognition, did not use tears as a weapon. And that, my lords, is more strength than I see in this entire room." I could feel the anger vibrating from the council members, but none dared to speak. The king returned to his chair, sat and gestured in my direction. "Approach!" My body obeyed before my mind could process. I walked to the table, each step echoing on the stone floor, and stopped where he indicated beside his chair. He looked at me, and again I saw that thing I couldn't name in his eyes. "Are you afraid?" he asked, low enough for only me to hear. I considered lying, but something told me he would know. "Yes," I whispered. "But being afraid is not the same as being weak." A tiny smile touched his lips, so brief I thought I had imagined it. Then he turned to the council. "This meeting is over. You are all dismissed." There was hesitation, muffled protests, but one look from him was enough to set them all in motion. One by one, the council members rose and left, each casting me looks that ranged from curiosity to pure hatred. When the last person had left and the door closed, I was alone with him for the first time. The silence stretched between us, heavy and full of unsaid words. I didn't know if I should speak, if I should stay, if I should go. Finally, he stood and walked to the large window overlooking the gardens. The moon was rising, a crescent moon that cast a silvery light on everything. "Do you know why I did that at the coronation?" he asked, still looking out. I hesitated. "No, Your Majesty." He turned to look at me, and the moonlight transformed him into something almost supernatural. Because when I walked into that hall full of fake smiles and empty loyalties, you were the only person who didn't look away. They all bowed, they groveled, they tried to make themselves smaller to please me. But you looked me in the eye, even while trembling, even while afraid. And I thought, this is the only honest person in this entire room. His words shocked me. I didn't know what to say, how to react. He took a few steps in my direction but maintained a respectful distance. I am not asking for anything from you, he said. I don't expect gratitude, I don't expect devotion, but I will offer you protection. In this castle full of snakes, you now have a shield. Use it wisely. Before I could answer, he was already walking toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob and looked back. And one more thing. Stop dressing as if you're apologizing for existing. You are my moon. Shine. He left, and I remained alone in the council room, my legs weak and my mind spinning. What kind of man was he? What kind of game was he playing? And why, despite all my skepticism, all my fear, was there a part of me that wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a game? In the following weeks, things became more complicated. I was transferred from the kitchens to the main quarters, which meant I no longer washed dishes or scrubbed floors. Now I sat in on meetings, organized documents, and was present in situations where normal servants would never be. The change was not well received. The other servants saw me as a traitor, someone who had sold out to climb the ladder. The nobles saw me as a threat, an intruder in their world. And I, caught between two worlds, belonged to neither. Lady Morgana became my declared enemy. She no longer tried to hide her hatred, finding every opportunity to sabotage me. She spread rumors that I had bewitched the king, that I used black magic, that I was a spy for enemy kingdoms. The rumors were absurd, but they took hold. People wanted to believe them because it was easier to believe I had some supernatural power than to accept that the king had simply chosen me. One day, I found poison in my food. It was a weak poison, enough to make me sick but not to kill me, probably intended to humiliate me publicly. But I had grown up in the kitchens and I knew the smell of every spice, every herb. I noticed the bitter odor immediately and threw the food away. Another day, I nearly fell down a flight of stairs because someone had rubbed oil on the steps. And there was the night I found my room completely destroyed, every possession I owned torn or broken. Did I tell the king about the incidents? No, I don't know why, but something inside me refused to run to him for protection at every small attack. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the fear that if I seemed too weak, he would lose interest. Or maybe it was simply because I wanted to prove to myself more than to anyone else that I could survive. So I dealt with each attack alone, becoming more vigilant, more cautious, stronger. But there were moments, strange and unexpected moments, where the barrier between me and the king grew thinner. One afternoon, I was organizing documents in the library when he entered. He said nothing, just sat in one of the armchairs near the fireplace and began to read. I was tense at first, expecting him to speak or ask for something, but he just read, and after a few minutes I realized his presence was comfortable, not threatening, not demanding, just there. This became a pattern. He would appear where I was, not to interact, but simply to be in the same space. Sometimes he brought work, sometimes he just sat in silence. And slowly, very slowly, I began to relax in his presence. I started to see him not as the fearsome king, but as a man who carried an immense weight and who, perhaps, also felt alone. One night, he broke the silence that had stretched between us for hours. "Do you read?" he asked. I looked at him surprised. "Yes, Your Majesty." "My grandmother taught me." He nodded, as if that confirmed something. "What kind of stories do you like?" It was such a common, normal question that it caught me off guard. "Stories about people who survive," I answered after thinking. "People who go through the worst and still find reasons to keep going." He was quiet for a moment. "So you like stories about yourself?" The observation hit me unexpectedly. I had never thought of myself that way, as someone worthy of a story. "I don't know if my life qualifies as a story," I said. "It's more a succession of days trying not to be destroyed." He stood and walked to the window as he always did when he was pensive. "All the best stories are about survival," he said. "Tales of perfect heroes are boring, but stories of imperfect people who refuse to give up, Those are worth telling. I felt something tighten in my chest at his words. For so long, I had seen myself only as someone to be discarded, someone worthless. But the way he spoke, the way he looked at me, suggested something else. It suggested he saw something in me that I couldn't see myself. Why did you choose me? I asked suddenly. The question slipped out before I could stop it. It wasn't to protect me. It wasn't out of kindness, so why? He turned. To face me. And his eyes carried an intensity that made me swallow hard. Because you are real, he said simply. In this world of masks and lies, you are the only real thing I've found. He walked to where I stood, stopping so close I could feel his heat. And because when I looked at you in that hall, I saw myself. Not the version everyone sees, not the king, not the warrior, but what was left after everything was taken from me. You understand what it is to have nothing but the refusal to break. And that, more than any title or noble blood, is something I respect. My breathing was uneven, my heart beating too fast. He raised a hand, and for a moment I thought he was going to touch me, but he simply brushed a lock of hair from my face. You don't have to trust me, he said softly. You don't need me, but know that as long as I breathe, no one else will make you bow. And then he left, leaving me alone with a whirlwind of emotions I didn't know how to process. Life continued its strange rhythm. The attacks against me didn't stop, but they became more subtle. People learned that obvious methods didn't work, so they changed tactics. Instead of attacking me directly, they began to isolate me. Conversations would stop when I entered a room. Important information was deliberately withheld from me. Tasks were given to me with incomplete instructions, designed to make me fail. It was a more sophisticated form of cruelty, and in some ways more effective. But there was one person who didn't avoid me, a young servant named Helena. She was new to the castle, maybe a year or two younger than me, with red hair and a face full of freckles. She approached me one afternoon while I was in the garden and simply sat beside me without asking permission. I know what it's like, she said. To be different, to be the person everyone hates for no reason. I looked at her surprised. People hate you? She smiled sadly. My mother was a witch. Well, they called her a witch. She was really just a healer who knew how to use herbs, but she was burned anyway. I escaped, came here, lied about who I was. But there's always someone who finds out, who whispers, who makes you remember you're not welcome. I found in Helena something I hadn't had since my grandmother's death. A friend. Someone who saw me as a person, not as a symbol or a threat. We talked late at night, sharing fears and hopes, and slowly her presence made the days more bearable. She also had a different perspective on things. You know, half the women here would kill to be in your place, right? She said once. To be chosen by the king, even if it's not official, even if it's not marriage. That's power. It doesn't feel like power, I replied. It feels more like a target on my back. Helena shook her head. Because you haven't learned to use it yet. Power isn't about brute force or titles. Power is about influence, about making people hesitate before they attack you, about having access to places and information others don't. You have all of that now. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Her words stayed with me. Was I wasting the unique position I found myself in? I had always seen myself as a victim of circumstances, but what if I could be more? What if I could not just survive, but thrive? The idea was both frightening and exciting, but there was a problem. I didn't know how to play the games of the court. I had no training, no experience, and every mistake could be fatal. It was Helena who began to teach me. She had grown up watching her mother deal with local politics and had a natural talent for understanding people. Look at Lady Morgana, she said one day as we watched a banquet from afar. She's beautiful, rich, powerful, but look at her eyes. She's desperate. Desperate for her father's approval. Desperate to secure a marriage that will maintain her position. Desperate not to lose relevance. That desperation is a weakness. I watched Lady Morgana with new eyes and realized Helena was right. Behind the mask of confidence was fear. I started to pay attention, to really observe the people around me, and I discovered that the castle was a nest of insecurities and fears. The lords were afraid of losing power. The ladies were afraid of growing old and being replaced. The warriors were afraid of being considered weak. And everyone was afraid of the king, which meant that, by association, they were now afraid of me, too. This fear could be a weapon if I knew how to wield it. My first attempt to use my position was small but significant. One of the younger servants, a boy of maybe 14, was accused of stealing food from the kitchens. The punishment was to be severe, possibly a public flogging, but I had seen what really happened. One of the guards had taken the food and blamed the boy. I went to the king, for the first time since he had offered me his protection, and told him the truth. He listened in silence, then summoned the guard and the boy. With a few questions, he extracted the truth, and the guard was punished instead of the boy. The news spread quickly. The nameless servant had interceded for someone, and the king had listened. Suddenly, other people started coming to me with small problems, minor injustices. I couldn't help everyone, and I didn't take every case to the king. But when I could resolve something on my own, or when something was serious enough to merit his attention, I acted. And slowly, very slowly, I began to build something I never imagined I would have. Allies. People who owed me favors, people who saw value in keeping me alive. This did not go unnoticed by the nobles. Lord Aldrich, in particular, seemed disturbed by my growing influence. He summoned me one afternoon asking to speak with me in private. I went cautiously, expecting a trap, but when I arrived at his office, he was alone, sitting behind a massive desk covered in documents. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. I hesitated, but sat. "You're smarter than you look," he began, watching me with those snake-like eyes. "You're building a network, gaining loyalties. That's impressive for someone with no training." I didn't respond, just waited. He smiled coldly. "But let me offer a piece of advice from someone who has been playing this game for much longer. Loyalties built on favors are fragile. When someone with more resources comes along, these same people will betray you without a second thought." "That's true," I agreed, surprising him. "But loyalty built on fear is also fragile. When the source of the fear disappears, it dissolves. So we're all just building sandcastles, aren't we? The question is who has time to finish theirs before the tide comes in." He studied me for a long moment, and then he laughed. It was a genuine, almost appreciative laugh. "You might survive here after all. But remember, surviving is not the same as winning. And in this castle, there's only room for one winner." I left that meeting unsettled. Lord Aldrich was not like Lady Morgana, driven by emotion and wounded pride. He was calculating, patient, dangerous. And now I was on his radar as more than a curiosity or an irritation. I was a player on the board, and that meant he was taking me seriously. I didn't know if that was a good or a bad thing. Winter arrived with force, bringing snow and biting winds. The castle grew colder, darker, and tensions rose. Resources were scarce, and difficult decisions had to be made about distributing food and heat. It was during this period that the king convened an expanded council, including not just the lords, but also representatives of the workers, the soldiers, and the merchants. And he summoned me as well. When I entered the room, the stares were immediate. I didn't belong there, and everyone knew it. But the king gestured to a chair beside him, a place of honor that made more than one person visibly choke. I sat down, keeping my expression neutral, but inside my heart was racing. What was he doing? Why put me in such an exposed position? The meeting began and quickly devolved into a heated argument about how to allocate limited resources. The lords wanted to ensure their lands were prioritized. The merchants demanded protection for their routes. The soldiers asked for better equipment. Each group pulled for its own side, and no agreement seemed possible. The king let the argument continue for hours, just observing, and I wondered if he was testing something. Finally, when the argument was about to turn into a brawl, he raised a hand, and everyone fell silent. "Have you heard your own words?" he asked, a cold disappointment in his voice. "Every one of you is concerned only with your own interests. The lords want to protect their lands, but don't care if the merchants freeze to death on the roads. The merchants want safe routes, but don't care if the soldiers lack proper armor. And the soldiers want equipment, but don't care if the common people starve." He stood up, his presence filling the room. "This is the problem with this kingdom. You all think in parts, not as a whole. And as long as you continue to do so, we will remain weak." He paused, and then he looked at me. "What do you think?" The question caught me completely off guard. All eyes turned to me, some curious, others hostile. My mouth went dry. What could I possibly say that would be useful? I knew nothing of politics, of economics, of war. But then I remembered Helena's words about observing, about understanding people. And I remembered my own experience being at the bottom of the hierarchy. "I think perhaps we're asking the wrong question," I said slowly, choosing each word with care. "We shouldn't be asking how do I protect what's mine, but how do we keep everyone alive long enough to see the spring? Because if the common people starve, there will be no workers for the Lord's lands. If the merchants can't travel, there will be no trade to generate wealth. If the soldiers don't have proper equipment, there will be no protection for anyone. Everything is connected." There was silence. Then, unexpectedly, one of the workers' representatives, an old man with calloused hands, slammed his hand on the table in approval. "The girl is right," he said in a hoarse voice. "It's no good for the Lords to be well if the rest of us die. Because when spring comes, who will plant the crops? Who will build? Who will fight?" Others began to murmur in agreement. The king smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Exactly. So, let's stop fighting over crumbs and start thinking about how to make the cake bigger." The discussion that followed was more productive. It wasn't perfect, and many still resisted, but there was now a direction, a common focus. And when the meeting finally ended hours later, I realized something had changed. People no longer looked at me with the same disdain. There was still suspicion, still hostility, but there was also a hesitation, a re-evaluation. I had proven, however minimally, that perhaps I had something to contribute. When everyone had left, the king stayed behind. The two of us remained in the empty room, lit only by the dying fire in the hearth. "You did well," he said. "I wasn't testing you," he added, as if reading my mind. "I was testing them. I wanted to see how they would react to a different voice, a perspective they would normally ignore, and you proved my point better than I ever could have." I looked at him. At this man I still didn't fully understand. "Why?" I asked. "Why do you keep putting me in these positions? What do you gain from it?" He walked to the window, watching the snow fall outside. "Because I need to change this kingdom, and I can't do it alone. I need people who think differently, who see things I don't see. And I need to show everyone here that value doesn't come from blood or title, but from character and intelligence. You are my living proof of that," he turned to face me. "And because selfishly, your presence reminds me that not everything here is rotten. That there is still honesty, still strength that doesn't depend on armor or swords." His words touched me more deeply than I wanted to admit. There was a vulnerability in them, a confession of loneliness that mirrored my own. And in that moment, I understood that we were two people whom fate had placed in positions we were unprepared for, trying to survive as best we could. The difference was that he had power, and I had only the refusal to give up. But maybe together we could be something more. "May I ask a question?" I said. He nodded. "Have you never been tempted to just give up? To let this place rot, to walk away?" He considered the question for a long moment. "Every day," he admitted. But then I remember why I accepted this crown. It wasn't for power or glory. It was because I saw what happens when weak men rule. I saw entire villages starve while lords held feasts. I saw orphaned children on the streets while gold piled up in coffers. And I thought, if I have the strength to change this, then I have an obligation to try. "Even knowing you might fail?" I asked. "Even knowing they will fight you every step of the way?" He smiled sadly. "Especially because of that. Because if I give up, who will try? Who will fight for those who cannot fight for themselves?" It was an answer I understood deeply, because it was no different from my own refusal to bow to accept the place I was given. We were both in our own ways fighting against the same system that wanted us broken. The months that followed were a mix of small victories and painful defeats. I managed to help more people, built more connections, learned more about navigating the treacherous politics of the court. But I also faced increasingly severe retaliation. I found dead rats in my room. I received anonymous threats. And there was the terrible night I was almost physically attacked in the dark corridors, escaping only because Helena appeared at the right moment, screaming loud enough to attract guards. The king was furious when he found out. He summoned the entire court and made a declaration that left everyone pale. Any attack on me would be considered a direct attack on him. The punishment would be death, not exile, not prison. Death. It was effective in stopping direct attacks, but it made the hatred directed at me even more intense. Now I was not just an intruder, but someone who had won the king's absolute protection. It was unbearable for many. Lady Morgana in particular seemed on the verge of a breakdown. Her status had diminished drastically since I had arrived, and she couldn't accept it. She tried to approach me once, pretending to want to make peace. We met in one of the inner gardens, surrounded by rose bushes that had already lost their flowers to the winter. "I understand why he chose you," she said, her voice holding a strange quality, half admiring, half bitter. "You have something none of the rest of us have. You don't need him, and that fascinates him." I looked at her, at this beautiful, cruel woman who had tormented me so much. "I do need him," I corrected softly. "I need his protection to survive here. But you're right that I don't need him in the way you imagine. I don't need him to complete me or give me purpose. I already had those things before I met him." She laughed, but it was a humorless laugh. "And that's exactly what holds him. He is surrounded by people who fawn over him, who feign love or loyalty to gain favors. But you treat him like a person, not a king. And he's so starved for that, he can't see that you're a danger." "A danger to whom?" I asked. "To you? To the lords who fear change? Or a danger to him because I might eventually disappoint him?" She studied me for a long moment. "A danger to all of us," she said finally. "Because you are changing the rules of the game, and when the rules change, no one knows how to play anymore. That is terrifying." She turned to leave, but stopped and looked back. "Be careful. You may have his protection now, but protection doesn't make anyone invincible. And there are ways to destroy a person without killing them." Her words stayed with me, echoing in my mind for days. She was right. I had changed the rules, and that made everything unpredictable. But what disturbed me most was the last part. Ways to destroy me without killing me. What did she mean by that? My reputation was already non-existent. My past was known to everyone. What else could they take from me? And then I realized they could take the few people I cared about. Helena, the children in the kitchens who looked at me with something like hope, the servants who came to me for help. These were my weak points, and in a cruel game, weak points were targets. I started to be more cautious, more protective. I warned Helena to be careful, not to trust anyone. I tried to keep my distance from the people I had helped, fearing my proximity would put them in danger. But this created its own form of torment, loneliness. Even surrounded by people, even with the king occasionally present, I felt fundamentally alone. It was like being on a stage where everyone was watching, but no one really saw. It was during one of these lonely nights that the king found me on the balcony. I was watching the moon, an almost full moon that cast silver light on the snow-covered gardens. The wind carried the smell of a storm, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. I sensed his presence before I saw him, that shift in the atmosphere that always accompanied him. He approached silently and stood beside me, looking at the same moon. "Why do you never ask for anything?" he asked after a long silence. It was the same question he had asked before, and I gave the same answer. "Because nothing was ever given to me before. I learned not to expect it." He turned to look at me, and in the moonlight, his eyes seemed almost silver. "And what if I wanted to give you something? Not because you asked, but because I want to?" My heart sped up. "It depends on what it is." He smiled, a small, sad smile. "Choose. Whatever you want, it will be yours." The offer surprised and frightened me. To be able to make a limitless request of a king was something people spent their entire lives dreaming of. But I didn't know what to ask for. Money. It meant nothing to me. A title? It would just be another reason for hatred. Revenge against those who had hurt me? The idea was tempting, but empty. What did I really want? "I want freedom," I said finally. "But not freedom from you or this place. I want freedom from fear. I want to be able to walk the halls without wondering who will attack me. I want to be able to sleep without dreaming of past humiliations. I want to be free in my own skin." He was quiet for so long I thought I had offended him. But then he spoke, and his voice carried an emotion I rarely heard from him. "That is the one thing I cannot give you. I can protect you. I can give you power. I can give you everything in this kingdom. But freedom from fear? That you must win for yourself, because it comes from within, not from without." He raised a hand and touched my face gently. "But I can give you something that might help. I can give you my name, marry you, make you queen. That would give you an unassailable position, authority that no one could question." My heart stopped. Marriage? To be queen? It was so absurd, so impossible, I couldn't process it. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would you do that?" His hand was still on my face, and his eyes held mine with an intensity that made me tremble. Because in all the months since I first saw you, you have been the only real, constant thing in my life. Because when I am with you, I can stop being the king and just be a man. Because you challenge me, you confront me, you make me think. And because against all logic and reason, I have fallen in love with you. The words hit me like a lightning bolt. Love. He was talking about love. And I, who had never believed I would be loved, who had spent my life being despised, now stood before the most powerful man in the kingdom telling me he loved me. It was unreal. It was terrifying. I didn't know what it was. I don't know if I can love you back, I said honestly. I don't know if I know how to love. I've spent so long just surviving that I've forgotten how to feel anything else. I know, he said softly. And I am not asking for immediate love. I am asking for a chance, an opportunity for us to build something together, without pressure, without expectations. If you accept being my queen, it will be a partnership of mutual respect above all else. The rest, if it comes, will come with time. It was a fair offer, fairer than I deserved, but there was so much at stake. If I accepted, I would become a permanent target for every person who desired power. If I refused, I could lose the one person who had seen me as more than trash. Can I think about it? I asked. He nodded. As long as you need. But know that my offer is not timed. When you are ready, if you are ready, just say the word. He lowered his hand and took a step back. And regardless of your answer, my protection continues. You will always be my moon, Helena. With or without a crown, he used my name. For the first time since we had met, he said my name out loud. And something about that simple act of recognition broke something inside me. The tears came without warning, streaming silently down my face. They weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of release. All the emotions I had bottled up, all the wounds I had never let heal, finally found an outlet. He pulled me into his arms and I let myself go, crying against his chest as he held my head gently. He didn't offer soothing words, didn't try to stop my tears. He just held me, offering his silent presence as I finally allowed myself to feel. When I finally stopped, when I had no more tears to shed, I pulled away, embarrassed. I'm sorry, I murmured. He shook his head. Never apologize for feeling? Emotion is not weakness. He wiped a remaining tear from my face with his thumb. You have carried so much for so long alone. It's time to share the weight. And in that moment, under the light of the moon that had once denied me, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't love yet, not in the traditional sense, but it was trust, it was connection. It was the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I didn't always have to be alone. In the following days, I didn't give him my answer, but something between us had changed. There was a new intimacy, an ease that hadn't existed before. He would seek me out not just for silent company, but to talk, to ask for my opinion, to simply be present. And I, who had always protected myself with distance, began to lower my defenses. I told him about my childhood, about the humiliations, about the dreams I had abandoned of having a normal life. And he, in turn, shared his own scars. A brutal childhood where love was seen as weakness. A relentless training that broke more men than it made. The loneliness of always being at the top, with no one who truly understood. We discovered that our pains, though different in scale and circumstance, were fundamentally similar. We had both been forged by rejection and loneliness. We had both learned that survival required hardness, and we were both tired of just surviving, wanting to finally live. It was Helena who confronted me about my hesitation. Are you going to accept or not? She asked directly one afternoon as we were folding linen. I looked at her, surprised. How do you know about the proposal? She rolled her eyes. Please. The whole castle knows. You two aren't exactly discreet and people gossip. So? I don't know, I admitted. It's so big, so permanent. What if I mess it up? What if I can't be what he needs? Helena dropped the linen and grabbed me by the shoulders. Listen to what I'm saying. You are already what he needs. Why do you think he waited so long to marry? Because he was waiting for someone real. Someone who would challenge him. Someone who wouldn't bow just because he's the king. And that person is you. So stop being afraid and grab this chance. Because how many people like us get the opportunity to completely change their lives? Her words echoed in my mind for days. She was right. How many people in my position would get such an opportunity? And more importantly, what did I really want? Did I want security? Yes. Did I want respect? Yes. Did I want the power to make a difference in the lives of people like me, who were born with nothing and trampled by a cruel system? Definitely yes. And being queen would give me all of those things. But there was a deeper reason, one I hardly wanted to admit to myself. I wanted to be near him. Not out of dependence, but because in his presence I felt seen. Completely, profoundly seen. I made my decision on a full moon night, exactly 1 year after the night he had first chosen me. It was deliberate, symbolic, a way of closing the circle. I asked to meet him on the balcony where we had our most honest conversation and waited nervously as the moon rose in the sky. When he appeared, my heart leaped, but I kept my voice steady. I have an answer for you. He stopped, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something like nervousness in his eyes. And what is it? I took a deep breath. Yes, I accept to be your queen. The relief on his face was palpable. He crossed the distance between us in 2 strides and pulled me into his arms, holding me so tight I could barely breathe. You won't regret this, he promised against my hair. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you don't regret it. I laughed, a sound that surprised us both. Don't make promises you can't keep. I'll probably drive you crazy. He pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes, and his lips met mine in a soft, questioning kiss. It was my first kiss, and it was so different from what I had imagined. It wasn't violent or demanding. It was gentle, almost reverent, as if he were touching something precious. When we parted, we were both trembling slightly. This changes everything, I said, still processing. I know, he replied. And it's going to be hard. The court will fight it. There will be scandal, revolt, attempts to sabotage our union, but we'll face it together. I looked up at the moon above us, that same moon that had supposedly rejected me. But tonight it shone brightly, illuminating the path ahead. And I realized that maybe the moon had never rejected me. Maybe it was just waiting for the right moment to show me my true destiny. The announcement of our wedding was made the next day during a public audience. The reaction was exactly what we expected: shock, anger, open protest. Several lords rose in opposition, citing tradition and bloodline. Lady Morgana fainted dramatically, though I suspected it was staged. The servants stood in shocked silence, not knowing how to react. And through it all, the king remained unshakable, making it clear that his decision was final, and any disrespect toward me would be treated as treason. The wedding preparations began immediately, and I was dragged into a world I didn't know. Seamstresses, jewelers, etiquette advisors, protocol tutors, all trying to mold me into the image of what a queen should be. It was exhausting and at times humiliating, especially when the noble women assigned to help me made a point of highlighting every mistake, every gap in my knowledge. But I endured it, remembering that every small humiliation I withstood now would be rewarded with the power to change the system. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 weeks later, enough time for basic preparations, but short enough not to give opponents time to organize real resistance. And finally the night arrived. I wore a silver gown that seemed to be made of moonlight, with embroidery so delicate it looked like spiderwebs. My hair, for the first time, was styled by skilled hands, caught up in elaborate braids intertwined with white flowers. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She was no longer the invisible servant. She was someone who looked like she belonged. But beneath the external transformation, I was still me. I still carried the same scars, the same fears, the same stubborn strength. And it was this person who walked down the aisle to the great hall where hundreds of people awaited. My heart was beating so hard I thought everyone could hear it, but I kept my steps steady. There was no father to give me away, no family to accompany me. It was just me, alone, choosing my own path. When I entered the hall and saw him waiting at the altar, everything else disappeared. The hostile stares, the whispers, the weight of the responsibility I was accepting. All that mattered was the man before me, the one who had seen value where others saw only trash. I walked to him, and when our hands joined, I felt something click into place, as if 2 broken pieces had finally found their fit. The priest's words passed in a blur. Promises were made, vows exchanged. And then came the words that changed everything. You are now queen. The silence that followed was absolute. And then, slowly, people began to kneel. First the guards, then the servants, then even the reluctant lords. One by one, they bowed, acknowledging my new position. And I, who had spent my entire life being forced to bow, was now standing tall, watching others bow to me. I didn't feel triumph, not even petty satisfaction. I felt only an overwhelming responsibility, because now I had real power to change things, and with power came the obligation to use it well. I looked at all those kneeling people and made a silent promise. I would not be like those who had trampled me. I would use this position to protect the vulnerable, to give a voice to the silenced, to build a kingdom where worth was measured by character and not by birth. The banquet after the ceremony was tense. People ate and drank, but the conversations were forced, the smiles fake. I sat beside my new husband in the place of highest honor and watched everything with new eyes. As queen, I was no longer invisible. Every move I made was watched, every word weighed. It was suffocating but also liberating, because for the first time I had real power to create change. The night wore on, and eventually we retired to the royal chambers. It was strange to be there in that place of obscene luxury that was now my home. Canopy beds, carpets softer than clouds, walls covered in art. Everything so different from the small, cold room where I had spent my life. He noticed my discomfort and smiled gently. It will take time to get used to. What if I never get used to it? I asked. What if I always feel like I don't belong? He pulled me close. Then we will change things until you feel you belong. This place can adapt to you, Helena. You don't have to adapt to it. That night, lying beside him, looking up at the ornate ceiling, I thought about everything that had happened. A year ago, I was nothing, a nobody. A servant rejected 3 times with no family, no future, no hope. And now I was queen. It was impossible, absurd, and yet real. But I knew the real fight was just beginning, because being queen on paper was one thing. Earning respect, creating real change, surviving the court's intrigues, that would be another battle entirely. But for the first time in my life, I was not alone in this fight. I had a partner, an ally, someone who believed in me when I barely believed in myself. And I had something more. I had purpose. I was no longer just surviving day by day. I was building something, fighting for something, becoming something greater than myself. And that, I realized, was what had always been missing. It wasn't love I needed to complete me. It was purpose. It was the ability to make a difference. It was the chance to turn pain into power, rejection into redemption. I turned to look at the man sleeping beside me, my husband, my king, but more importantly, my partner on this impossible journey. And I felt, finally, that slippery emotion I thought I would never know. It wasn't the romantic love of fairy tales. It was something deeper, more lasting. It was admiration, respect, gratitude, and, yes, a growing form of affection that might, with time, become something more. The moon shone through the window, casting a silver light over us both, and I smiled, remembering his words on that night that changed everything. She is my moon. They had tried to tell me the moon had forgotten me, that even the gods rejected me, but they were wrong. The moon was just waiting patiently for the right moment. And now, finally, it shone on me, not with rejection, but with approval. Not as a punishment, but as a blessing. Because I learned that sometimes the greatest power comes not from never falling, but from getting up every time you are knocked down. And I had gotten up so many times that I was now stronger than those who had never needed to fall. The future would be difficult. There would be battles, betrayals, moments of doubt. But I was ready, because I was no longer the scared girl hiding in the shadows. I was the queen, and the entire kingdom was about to find out what it meant to underestimate someone who had nothing left to lose. If this story touched your heart, leave your comment sharing your impressions. Your interaction helps us continue to bring stories that inspire and move you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys we have prepared with so much care for you. Until the next story,